Well, thank you, Gil, for that kind introduction. I would also like to thank the Oriental Institute for inviting me to speak tonight on death and taxes in ancient Egypt. In this lecture, I basically want to describe the evolution of the ancient Egyptian tax system from the Old Kingdom through the Ptolemaic period. I wish to highlight how the gradually increasing use of metallic money, or coinage, slowly transformed the Egyptian tax system. I use the term metallic money to include lumps of unminted copper, silver, and gold, which strictly speaking are not coinage. I will therefore divide my talk into two parts. A first part focusing on the tax system in the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE, when the use of metallic money was rare and limited to merchants. And a second part focusing on the tax system in the 1st millennium BCE, when the use of metallic money and then coinage became more widespread. For each of these periods, I will discuss what was collected as taxes, how these taxes were collected, who collected the taxes, and what happened when the poor taxpayers could not pay their taxes, which is, I'm sure, what you're most interested in. The evidence for some of this is ambiguous. In such cases, I take a diachronic institutional approach. That is, in ambiguous cases, I favor the interpretation that results in the greatest institutional continuity with preceding or following periods. I turn now to the first part of my lecture, which is the Egyptian tax system in the 3rd and 2nd millennium BCE. The first issue is what was collected as taxes. One of the basic principles of taxation is that one should collect taxes in media that circulate like money, or grow like grain, or are produced, or are otherwise renewed. As the Roman Emperor Tiberius supposedly said, "A good shepherd shears his sheep, he doesn't flay them." Consequently, virtually all modern taxes are collected in money. In the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms, however, taxes were almost never collected in money, probably because there simply was not enough metallic money in circulation to pay them. The vast majority of purchases and sales were made through barter exchange, rather than with metallic money. Weights of gold, silver, and copper were certainly used as measures of value, and probably also as stores of wealth, kept in hoards, like the El Til hoard from El Marna, depicted here. Some metal was even cut into relatively standardized pieces, known as shatis, which could have served as a kind of proto-coinage. However, very few purchases and sales seem to have used lumps of real metal or shatis, and most of those that did were made by professional merchants. There are relatively few records of real property transfers from the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms because the state was not interested in documenting them. There are some local records of real estate transfers, however, and these all refer to exchanges in kind. For example, an Old Kingdom stela from Giza records the exchange of a house worth 10 shatis for 6 pieces of cloth and a bed, also worth 10 shatis. There are also depictions of markets and tomb chapels from both the Old Kingdom and from the New Kingdom. The labels on the Old Kingdom depictions suggest that exchanges usually involved the barter of certain commodities, most often grain or bread, for other commodities. These other commodities included perishable goods such as fish, fruits, and vegetables, as well as imperishable goods. There is only one depiction of actual metal shatis being exchanged for cloth, which was itself a relatively high-value commodity used for the purchase of real estate. And that one depiction is shown here in the lower right-hand corner of the market scene in the tomb chapel of Khnum and Khnum-Hotep. So that's the depiction of the cloth being exchanged for shatis. Similar exchanges are recorded in hieratic on numerous limestone ostraca from Deir el-Medina in the New Kingdom. They too suggest that commodities valued at a certain weight of metal were exchanged directly for other commodities valued at the same weight of metal. Ships' logs from the New Kingdom also record exchanges as they sailed up and down the Nile River, buying and selling goods at the riverbank on behalf of the king, temples, and even private households. Most of these exchanges appear to have been in kind as well, though some may have involved weights of gold and silver. So, because metallic money did not circulate very wildly, the state collected taxes in other renewable commodities, mainly grain and labor. So how did the ancient Egyptians collect taxes without money? Well, whether taxes involve money or not, there are two main ways of collecting them. That is by counting and measuring, or at bottlenecks. Counting and measuring is one common way of collecting taxes. One makes a list of people or properties. In the case of properties, one can count livestock or measure land or value them. Then one goes down the list and collects a fixed amount from each person, or for each head of livestock, or for each unit area of land, or a fraction of their value. The advantage of this method is that one can predict fairly accurately how much revenue one should receive, particularly if one counts and measures rather than values. This is good for planning, and also for checking one's tax collectors to make sure they do not take a cut for themselves. Bottlenecks are the other common way of collecting taxes. One sets up a barrier and collects a fee from everyone or for everything passing through it. This fee can be fixed or a fraction value of objects. The barrier can be a real barrier located at a bridge or a border or a port to collect tolls and customs duties. However, it can also be a registration requirement at a government office to collect sales taxes on real estate and autos. It can even be a cash register machine, not in ancient Egypt, of course, to collect sales taxes on minor transactions. The disadvantage to this method is that it is difficult or even impossible to predict how much revenue one should receive. This makes it difficult to plan for these revenues and also to check the tax collectors. In the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms, the state primarily exacted taxes in kind and in labor, and it did so primarily by counting and measuring. It used field surveys to collect a portion of the harvest as taxes, and it used censuses to exact compulsory labor services. As previously mentioned, the state did not document private property transfers apart from the field surveys. Consequently, the state had no bottleneck at which it could tax private property transfers. Customs duties may have been levied on goods entering the country through various bottlenecks, like Nubia in the Middle Kingdom. Even here, however, duties were probably collected in kind rather than in money. Now, the Old Kingdom produced some of the most impressive public works ever built, the Great Pyramids. The labor for these projects was probably fed with grain collected as harvest taxes, and the labor may have been a form of compulsory service. And yet we know relatively little about how taxes were collected in the Old Kingdom. In the Old Kingdom, the evidence for field surveys and censuses is fairly ambiguous. It consists primarily of references to a biennial occasion of the count. The vast majority of references to the occasion of the account were abbreviated to the occasion because they were used to indicate the date. They take the form year of the Xth occasion of King Y, or the year after the Xth occasion of King Y. However, some references to the occasion of the count are written fully as the year of the Xth occasion of the count of King Y, or the year after. And in a very few of these cases, the occasion of the count is qualified of gold and fields, or of all small cattle. This interpretation of the count as a census of objects of taxation seems to be supported by a passage in the autobiography of Weni from his tomb at Abydos. In his autobiography, he describes how he worked his way up through the ancient Egyptian civil service, until he became overseer of Upper Egypt and vizier, the highest offices underneath the king. As overseer of Upper Egypt, he was responsible for the account on 2 occasions. This interpretation is further supported by the fact that in later periods, harvest taxes were collected on the basis of land surveys, and compulsory labor was collected on the basis of censuses of people. However, if there was a census of objects of taxation in the Old Kingdom, it may have been less comprehensive than those in later periods. The indirect evidence for tax collection in the Old Kingdom suggests that responsibility may have been assigned collectively to estates and towns, rather than to individuals in their fields, as in later periods. Such collective responsibility would have required less detailed surveys and censuses than those attested in later periods. In the Old Kingdom, the Egyptian countryside was organized at the local level into administrative units consisting of agricultural land and its cultivators. The Egyptian names for these units are categorized by their determinatives into estates and towns. The tax revenues from these estates and towns were assigned to royal palaces and to funerary establishments. Personifications of these estates and towns were thus depicted in tomb chapels associated with funerary establishments. Inscription and scenes from 5th and 6th dynasty tomb chapels revealed that estates and towns were managed by relatively low-ranking chiefs. Chiefs of estates were usually titled as such, chiefs of estates, while chiefs of towns were sometimes just called chiefs. A scene from the 5th dynasty mortuary chapel of Tea, shown here, depicts 3 chiefs of towns being beaten before 5 scribes during accounting by the Jajat court of a funerary establishment. The term accounting suggests taxation, as we have seen, so presumably the chiefs' towns had failed to pay their taxes to the funerary establishment. Similarly, a badly damaged scene from the mortuary chapel of the 6th dynasty vizier Kentikah shows 5 chiefs of estates being beaten before Kentikah and 2 scribes of a funerary establishment, presumably because the chiefs' estates had also failed to pay their taxes. Estates and towns thus seem to have been collectively responsible for harvest taxes and compulsory labor, and their representatives were held corporally responsible. In the short run, collective responsibility for taxes can be attractive for a state because it reduces its management costs and risks. The state deals with a limited number of community representatives rather than a large number of individuals, thereby reducing its management costs. Furthermore, if some individuals fail to pay their share, then others in their communities must make up their shortfalls, thereby guaranteeing the state its revenues. However, collective responsibility can also discourage individuals from trying to increase their productivity, because they may just end up paying a larger share of their community's taxes, particularly if others slack off, or free ride, as it is technically called. I'm not making that up. That is the technical term. In the long run, this disincentive for growth could cost the state significant amounts of potential revenues. Consequently, most modern economists agree that collective responsibility for taxes is, I quote, not an optimum taxation strategy. The ancient Egyptians seem to have come to the same conclusion, because in the Middle Kingdom, they began to switch to individual responsibility for taxation. In the Middle Kingdom, there is strong evidence for field surveys used to calculate harvest taxes, and for censuses of people used to calculate compulsory labor services. The state appears to have calculated harvest taxes and compulsory labor for individual fields and people, thereby rewarding and encouraging individual productivity. At the same time, the state incurred higher management costs because it had to measure and count each field and person, and higher risks because it bore the loss of revenue whenever a person did not pay their taxes. The most direct evidence for field surveys in the Middle Kingdom consists of Papyrus Haraga III, a late Middle Kingdom fragment of a daybook of a tax assessor from the site of Haraga in the Egyptian Fayum. The scribe labels his work in line 12 as measuring with the scribes of the land of the southern district, in line 14 as assessing for him the dues in the office of the fields of the northern district, and in line 15 as registering in the office of the treasurer of the king and the overseer of fields of the northern district. The scribe works with officials titled in line 21 as the holder of the cords, and in line 22 as the stretcher of the cords. The cord described in Papyrus Haraga III was probably used to measure fields. A few New Kingdom tomb chapels have a scene showing a cord being stretched alongside a field, usually next to a scene showing the field being harvested, as in this example from the Theban tomb of Mena. Indirect evidence for field surveys in the Middle Kingdom also includes the duties of the vizier, a text inscribed in the tombs of New Kingdom viziers, but probably a Middle Kingdom composition. According to this text, the vizier was responsible for registering the field boundaries in lines 26 to 27, and for hearing petitions about disputed field boundaries in line 20. The duties of the vizier also indicate in lines 17 to 19 that petitioners could apply for an extension of 2 months, presumably to allow them to resolve their disputes about their fields before paying the harvest taxes on them. So the idea of a tax exemption is nothing, an extension for filing your taxes is not new. Note, however, that petitioners living near the vizier were only granted a 3-day extension, perhaps to dissuade them from making frivolous petitions simply to obtain an extension. The most direct evidence for censuses of people in the Middle Kingdom consists of a series of 3 census returns from El Ahun, again in the Egyptian Fayum. These are 3 household documents recording the composition of the household of Hori and his son Snefru at 3 different stages in its development. The information could have been collected in order to register people for compulsory labor, though these copies seem to have come from a private context. The best preserved of the 3 household documents is the last, P. Kahun 1-3, dated year 5 of King Sobek-Hotep I, in which Senefru takes over the household of his father, Hori. The document is said to have been sworn in the office of the vizier, in line 9, but to have been made in the office of the fields before witnesses, in lines 11 through 13, including a scribe in the Jajat court, in line 14. The office of the vizier was presumably the final destination for the information, and that's important. Unfortunately, there's no evidence directly linking the censuses from the Middle Kingdom with the collection of compulsory labor taxes. However, the information contained in the census returns was recorded in the office of the vizier, and the duties of the vizier states that the vizier was responsible for punishing those who failed to perform their compulsory labor by registering them in the roll of transgressors that is in the great prison, along with a summary of the case against them in lines 13 to 15 here. In fact, one of these rolls of transgressors that is in the great prison seems to have survived, Papyrus Brooklyn 35-1446, text A. It is a late Middle Kingdom list of 79 men and 1 woman who were imprisoned in the great prison for fleeing from their compulsory labor service, or whose relatives were imprisoned in their place. I've used the information about the woman Teti as an example. Each line of the papyrus gives the name and identity of one individual, entries A through C here, followed by a summary of a court case, entry D. The line concludes with the statement that the case has been closed, entries E through G. The list was almost certainly kept in the office of the vizier, because several royal decrees to the vizier were copied into blank spaces in the list. The implication is that those who failed to perform the compulsory labor were thrown into the great prison, or if they fled, their relatives were thrown into prison in their place. Now, in the New Kingdom, the state continued the Middle Kingdom practice of individually measuring and counting fields and people, and of holding them individually responsible for taxes and labor, thereby rewarding individual increases in productivity. However, the state sought to reduce its high management costs and risks by employing temples as state agents to manage lands on its behalf and to assume some of its risks. To do this, the state increased the size and wealth of the temples by donating lands and revenues to them. The scale of these donations can be seen in the Harris Papyrus, a list of donations made by Ramses III to the gods of Egypt and their temples. The amount of land assigned to the temples was between 13 and 18% of all the cultivated land in Egypt. In addition, Pharaoh, of course, this may have been a renewal of previous donations, but nonetheless, it shows how much land the temples held. In addition, Pharaoh frequently entrusted state land to temples without giving it to them outright, which the temples then cultivated for Pharaoh alongside their own lands that Pharaoh had donated to them. And finally, both the state and the temples allowed private individuals to cultivate some of their lands in return for harvest taxes and compulsory labor. These privately cultivated lands were effectively private property, but for tax purposes, they were either state or temple land. Now, the Baldwin and Amiens papyri show that the temples sometimes collected the harvest taxes from state lands as well as their own, and stored them in their granaries. The papyri are accounts of a flotilla of ships belonging to the Temple of Amun, which sailed down the Nile, stopping to pick up grain harvest tax payments from ports along the way in order to deposit them in temple granaries. The temple granaries thus acted as branches of a state granary system. Whenever the pharaoh wished to supply a local project, such as excavating and decorating the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, for example, he could draw the rations from state grain taxes stored in the granaries of a nearby temple, if there was no state granary in the area. Consequently, some temples had enormous storage magazines, like the Ramesseum at Thebes, depicted here. This system of dispersed and decentralized storage reduced transportation costs and minimized the risk of a single accident affecting a significant proportion of the state's grain reserves. The temples used their own harvest taxes to support their priests and to support temple craftsmen who produced linen, papyrus, and metalwork for the temple. In this way, the craftsmen were insulated from market fluctuation, while the temples could convert agricultural surplus to more durable goods. The king sometimes assigned the rights to exploit mineral resources to temples and allowed them to organize mining expeditions to exploit them. King Seti I assigned gold fields in Nubia and at Canais in the eastern desert of Egypt to his royal mortuary temple at Abydos, as recorded in the Nauri decree and the Canais decree. Papyrus British Museum 10401 in turn shows that the kings could exact levies from the temples and from temple production, which thus also served as local branches of the royal treasury as well as branches of the state granaries. Evidence for field surveys in the New Kingdom is provided by the Wilbur Papyrus, a survey of lands in northern Middle Egypt dating to year 4 of Ramses V. Text A of the papyrus lists about 2,800 plots of land in 279 paragraphs, giving their institutional affiliation either to a temple or to a royal estate. Plots in 156 paragraphs are characterized as being non-apportioning, meaning that all the harvest tax went to the institution with which they were affiliated. Plots in 116 paragraphs were characterized as being apportioning, meaning that the harvest tax was apportioned between the institution with which they were affiliated and a named individual who appears to have been responsible for the plot. The apportioning plots appear to have been effectively private land, albeit with a harvest tax obligation to a royal or temple institution. The individuals responsible for the apportioning plots are, for the most part, stable masters, soldiers, priests, women, and cultivators. Furthermore, there's evidence that the apportioning plots could be held hereditarily for multiple generations, in statements that the named holder of a plot was dead and it was in the possession of his children, or that the landholder held it together with his siblings. The Wilbur Papyrus thus makes it clear that the harvest taxes were calculated according to the surface area of the fields and not as a percentage of the harvest. This rewarded the enterprising farmer who produced more crops from the land because they kept the extra production. It also made the state's harvest tax revenues predictable and limited risks to income from underperforming farmers. A recently published papyrus in Turin, known simply as the Stato Civile, confirms that there was also a census in the New Kingdom. The papyrus records the population of Dar el-Medina, which housed the workmen who built the tombs of the pharaohs in the Valley of the Kings. It lists the inhabitants of each household together, and it gives their occupations and relationships to each other, like the Middle Kingdom household documents from El Lahun. It seems likely that the New Kingdom census was also used to collect compulsory labor. The ancient Egyptians believed that their afterlife would be organized much like the life itself. This was probably a comforting belief in many respects, but it also meant that they feared that they might have to pay taxes in the afterlife. Clearly, for the Egyptians, death was not an end, at least as far as taxes were concerned. Consequently, already in the late Middle Kingdom, but especially in the New Kingdom, they began including figurines known as shabtis or ushabtis in their burials, inscribed with a spell indicating that if the deceased was called to perform compulsory labor, the shabti should respond in his or her place. The same spell was also included in the Book of the Dead as chapter 6. Apparently, most Egyptians would have preferred to avoid compulsory labor if they could. This is not surprising because the shabti spell suggests that compulsory labor could consist of cultivating fields, irrigating, or even carrying sand. The New Kingdom literary text known as the Instruction of Amenhotep purports to be the advice of a New Kingdom tax collector to his son. The father exhorts his son to collect taxes fairly, which is an extended metaphor for the ancient Egyptian concept of ma'at, or righteous living. What makes the text particularly interesting, however, is that the father also describes in considerable detail all of the things that his son should not do, so that the text could also serve as a cheater's guide to tax collection. I've excerpted just one chapter here to give you a sense of it. For example, it advises, beware of tampering with the grain measure to falsify its fractions. In other words, the tax collector should not use a short measure to make the taxpayer pay more. It adds, cause it not to be empty inside. That would be a very short measure. It also commands, make not for yourself a measure of 2 capacities, presumably a vessel that supposedly contains 1 volume, but actually contains another. Chapter 17 continues saying, do not receive the harvest of a cultivator, meaning that the tax collector should not take it for himself. It adds, nor set a papyrus against him to harm him, meaning that the tax collector should not falsify his records. It further commands, do not enter into collusion with the grain measurer, nor defraud the share of the residents. And it goes on like this for 30-odd chapters. The residence here is another name for the state as embodied in the king and his palaces. Now, several copies of this text have survived, so it was apparently quite popular. Whether this was because the audience liked the idea of a just tax collector, or because they liked hearing about all of the ways a tax collector could, and presumably sometimes did, cheat, I cannot say. Another New Kingdom literary text, known as the Late Egyptian Miscellanies, describes tax collection from the point of view of the taxpayer. In the Old Kingdom, we saw that the village headman was accountable for tax payment shortfalls. But here we see that the individual farmer is held responsible. The punishment remains pretty much the same as previously, although being thrown down a well might be an innovation. The text was intended to demonstrate, these late Egyptian miscellanies were intended to demonstrate the superiority of the scribal profession to all others, however, so this might exaggerate slightly. I particularly like that the attendants here have to use special Nubian rods of palm to beat the taxpayers. Now, the ancient Egyptians did eventually start using money. In the late and Ptolemaic periods, exchanges appear to have been increasingly in money rather than in kind. Weights of gold, copper, and especially silver served as media of exchange, as well as measures of value and stores of wealth. These weights of metal increasingly took the form of coins after the Lydians invented coinage in Asia Minor in the 8th century BCE. There are growing numbers of formal real property transfer contracts from the 8th century BCE onwards. When these contracts name the prices paid for real property, they are in weights of silver, not objects worth a given weight of silver, as in earlier periods. This does not prove that payment was actually made in silver in every case, but it is suggestive. Loans of silver appear for the first time in the 8th century BCE, alongside loans of grain. Marriage contracts also appear in the 8th century BCE and mention transfers of large amounts of silver. I mean, I assume people were getting married before the 8th century BCE, it's just their contracts appear for the first time then. This silver is often described as being of a certain temple treasury, again suggesting that real silver is meant, or silver of a certain purity, but not objects worth a certain weight of silver. References to Greek coins, called Ionian staters, begin to appear in the 5th century BCE, from which time there are also increasing numbers of coin hoards in Egypt containing growing numbers of silver coins, many of them imported Athenian tetradrachmas or local imitations thereof. So how did the ancient Egyptians collect taxes once they started using money? In the late and Ptolemaic periods, the state continued to exact taxes in kind and in labor on the basis of field surveys and censuses. And it continued to use temples as state agents to help collect the harvest and compulsory labor taxes. I will not discuss these taxes in kind and in labor further because the basic system remained the same as in the New Kingdom. However, the state and its agents, the temples, also began collecting taxes in money alongside those taxes in kind and in labor. In the late period, the first money taxes were collected at bottlenecks. Only in the Ptolemaic period did the state start collecting money taxes using censuses. Now, in the late period, the state initially relied on its agents, the temples, to collect money taxes, thereby reducing the state's management costs and risks. However, in time, the state began to collect some money taxes itself. The earliest money taxes were sales taxes on real estate transfers. Initially, money appears to have been used most frequently for expensive transactions like real estate transfers, so it is logical that the first money taxes were levied on these transactions. In the 8th century BCE, the state arranged for its agents, the temples, to establish temple notaries to record all real property transfers. And the temples used this notarization requirement as a bottleneck at which they could collect a 10% sales tax. A couple of centuries later, in the 6th century BCE, temples also started collecting a money tax on the dead, or rather, on the burial of the dead, in cemeteries managed by the temples, which again served as a kind of bottleneck. The temples collected the tax from mortuary priests, who buried and performed rituals for the dead, and who received a significant contribution from the deceased's relatives for doing so. The tax was thus an occupational tax on mortuary priests, and it remained in use for following centuries, as you can see from this example here. The first money taxes that the state collected directly were customs duties levied at the border on goods entering Egypt. In addition to expensive real estate transfers, money was initially also used frequently by merchants and traders, so it was also logical that early money taxes were levied from them. The state may have required foreign merchants and traders to enter Egypt only at designated points, thereby creating bottlenecks at which it could collect customs duties on goods. Herodotus wrote that the 6th century king Amasis allowed the Greeks to settle at the site of Naucratis, located in the Egyptian delta on the Canopic branch of the Nile. He says further that in earlier times, Naucratis was the only emporium or trading port in Egypt, and that ships that came to any other branch of the Nile were required to sail onto the Canopic branch to Naucratis. He describes this concentration of trade at Naucratis as a privilege, but it could also have served as a bottleneck at which customs duties could be levied. By the 5th century BCE, however, when Herodotus wrote, Naucratis was no longer the only trading port in Egypt. Pelusium, located at the mouth of the Ptolemaic branch of the Nile on the eastern border of Egypt, probably served as a customs collection point for trade by sea as well as over land. Furthermore, there is an Aramaic papyrus from Elephantine at the southern border of Egypt, which contains a register of customs duties collected in money from ships and cargoes. As you can see from the map, Elephantine was a natural funnel or bottleneck for trade between Egypt and the south. However, the papyrus does not actually name Elephantine, and most of the ships named on it came from Greece. So some scholars have suggested that the papyrus was originally written in Heracleon Tonis, which was only later brought to Elephantine. Now, Heracleon Tonis was located at the mouth of the Canopic branch of the Nile, downstream from Naucratis, and it developed as its harbor. Much later, Heracleon Tonis sank into the sea and is now the focus of underwater archaeology. One of the recent discoveries from the sunken city of Heracleon Tonis is a huge basalt stela set up by the 4th century king Nectanebo I. It is a near twin to a stela found at Naucratis over 100 years ago, set up by the same king. The stela from Heracleon Tonis dedicates 10% of the harbor customs duties to the temple of Night at Sais, while the stela from Naucratis dedicates 10% of unspecified tax revenues. Note that these were not a tax of 10%, but rather 10% of the total tax revenues. Presumably the state kept the other 90% of the revenues. In the Ptolemaic period, the state collected increasing amounts of money taxes. It gradually abandoned using temples as agents to collect money taxes in favor of collecting them itself, and it began using private tax farmers to assume some of its risk. The Ptolemies took the giant step of introducing a capitation or poll tax in money on virtually the entire population of Egypt. Presumably by this time, money had become relatively common and was relatively widely used, so it was not impossible for people to acquire money to pay the capitation or poll tax. The Ptolemies collected the capitation tax using the same censuses that they used to collect the compulsory labor tax, which they continued to collect as well. Now, from 285 BCE to 263 BCE, the new capitation tax was known as the yoke tax and was levied on men, paralleling the old compulsory labor requirement, which was also only exacted from men. Then in 263 BCE, the yoke tax was replaced by a new capitation tax known as the salt tax, which was levied on both men and women. Certain individuals were, however, exempted from the salt tax, such as teachers of Greek, athletic coaches, victorious athletes, and actors. This was clearly an early attempt at social engineering through tax incentives to encourage the Egyptians to Hellenize or become more Greek. Note how the tax rate kept falling over the years. Scholars do not agree on why this happened, except they mostly agree that it probably was not due to the Ptolemies' generosity. Perhaps the Ptolemies had collected too many taxes in silver money in Egypt and had spent too much of it abroad rather than in Egypt, so that the population found it increasingly difficult to keep finding the silver money to pay their taxes, as it gradually flowed out of the country. According to this hypothesis, the Ptolemies lowered the tax rates to avoid a revolt, because the silver money was becoming increasingly rare. If so, they failed, because the Egyptians did revolt in 217 BCE, and peace was only restored 30 years later. As previously mentioned, the Ptolemaic state collected most of its money taxes itself, rather than using temples as agents. This meant that the state suffered a loss of revenue every time someone did not pay his or her taxes. To reduce the risk of loss of revenue, the Ptolemaic state introduced the practice of tax farming money taxes. Now basically, the state auctioned off the money tax revenues from a district for a year to the highest bidder. If the revenues turned out to be higher than the bid, the bidder received the surplus as profit. If the revenues were lower than the bid, the bidder had to pay the difference. In this way, the state's revenues were predictable and guaranteed, and the tax farmer could make a profit by assuming the state's risk. The modern technical term for this kind of tax farming is called underwriting. The colloquial term is gambling. Tax farming capitation taxes was easy because the census made tax revenues fairly predictable by multiplying the number of people in the district by the appropriate tax rates. This encouraged tax farmers to make bids close to this figure so that the state did not lose much money to the tax farmers. There was, however, a certain conflict of interest between the tax farmers, who wanted to collect as much taxes as possible, and the taxpayers, who wanted to pay as little as possible. To mitigate this conflict, the state tried to prevent taxpayers collecting the same taxes from the same people multiple times by forcing the tax farmers to issue tax receipts to the taxpayers. And here we have an example of one. On the other hand, failure to pay the capitation tax or any other tax could result in a taxpayer being thrown into prison, as in earlier periods. To avoid this fate, many delinquent taxpayers fled their place of residence, where they were registered for tax purposes. Those that fled often sought asylum in certain temples, where they could not be seized and arrested. These temples seem to have become very popular, and the Ptolemies kept granting the right of asylum to ever more temples in the course of the Ptolemaic period. Now, the Ptolemies also farmed other taxes than capitation taxes, such as the burial tax, and a variety of other similar professional taxes. These bottleneck taxes were less predictable than capitation taxes, and thus were riskier to farm, but also potentially quite profitable. Consequently, they were frequently farmed by the same professionals who paid the taxes, who knew the market best. I guess this is an early form of insider trading. The Ptolemaic state also introduced a network of royal banks to help collect money taxes. There was a royal bank in the capital of each province in Egypt, and there were branches of royal banks in many larger villages. These royal banks and their branches acted as extensions of the state treasury. Money taxes were deposited into treasury accounts at the local bank or branch, from which they could be used to pay the salaries of local officials, or they could be transferred to Alexandria as needed. Many scholars have argued that the Ptolemaic royal banks were a Greek innovation, but I believe that they were also modeled in part on the Egyptian granary system, where temple granaries acted as branches of the general state granary. Indeed, the Ptolemaic royal banks and the temple granaries used a very similar system of orders of payment or checks to transfer money and grain from one account to another or to authorize withdrawals. Now, in 30 BCE, the last Ptolemaic ruler, Cleopatra VII, committed suicide, and Egypt became part of the Roman Empire. Under the Romans, some aspects of taxation remained the same as in earlier periods. Field surveys were used to calculate and collect harvest taxes and grain, some of which were shipped to Rome. A census was used to collect compulsory labor services, as well as a poll tax and money. The Romans used neither temples nor tax farmers as agents to collect these taxes in Egypt, however. Instead, they made the taxpayers themselves responsible for collecting their own taxes on a rotating basis. In light of this profound change, I would like to end my discussion of death and taxes in ancient Egypt here, and I will leave it to you to decide whether you are better off or worse off than the ancient Egyptians. Thank you for your attention.